So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 26, Section 1, and we're going to be looking at the origins of the Cold War. And this Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States lasted roughly from 1945, the end of the Second World War, all the way up to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. So, very long, prolonged conflict. The reason it's called a Cold War is because, thankfully, we never saw a direct confrontation between these two, quote, superpowers. But we do see a competition, both violently and peacefully, between two different political and economic systems. So, between the United States and the Soviet Union, we have very different economic and political systems. The Soviet Union suffered heavily at the hands of the Nazis. In fact, more Soviets died as a result of the war than just about any other country. When the United States entered the war, we didn't commit any forces to help the Soviets. We never sent troops to the Russian front. We sent troops to help the British fight against Hitler. That was our focus. We never told Joseph Stalin about the atomic bomb. And in fact, we even delayed attacking Germany to allow the Soviets to incur the heavy losses in the invasion of Berlin. Essentially, we used the Soviets, and we cared little about their fate, and they died by the millions in this war. After the war was over, the United Nations was formed, an international peacekeeping organization representing every country on earth. And this was to be the new peacekeeping body. This was to be the new world forum where nations could come together and resolve disputes, hopefully in a peaceful, democratic manner. But this wound up becoming the arena where the United States and the Soviet Union competed for power, because the two countries maintained a leading role over the UN despite their differences. Because, of course, when we think about the economic and political system that is communism, you're thinking about a single-party, totalitarian, collective state. I know that's a lot of fancy words, but you're thinking of only one political party that maintains complete control over its people, that believes in the equal distribution of resources to the masses. And then you have the United States, capitalism. So a very, very different political and economic system. And so after the Second World War, in fact during, FDR passed away and his Vice President Harry Truman was sworn in. As I told you previously, the atomic bomb was so secret that Truman was not included in decisions related to the construction of the bomb. He was not even included in basic policy decisions. Some presidents choose to leave their vice president out of important decision-making roles. Some do include their vice president. And even though Truman was not a part of Roosevelt's circle of advisors, upon becoming president, he then had the responsibility of leading the post-war world. And a conference held following the end of the war in July of 1945 called the Potsdam Conference between the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union was seen by many as the official beginning of the Cold War, because Truman and Great Britain were going to this meeting to confront Joseph Stalin because he had not held up his end of the bargain. The world's leading powers had agreed to divide Germany into 4 different parts, allowing Soviet Union one of those parts. In return, Stalin had promised free elections throughout Eastern Europe, and they may choose to stay with the Soviet Union or they may choose to withdraw from the Soviet Union, and he broke that promise. In fact, he banned any democratic parties in any Eastern European country that was under the influence of the Soviets. And so at Potsdam, Truman became convinced that the U.S. and the Soviets had different goals. The Soviets actually wanted reparations from Germany, very much a resurgence of the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted Germany to pay for the war, And, of course, the United States objected. Truman had many of the same goals that Wilson had following the First World War. He hoped to rebuild Germany. He hoped to lead a new era of peace. Well, eventually, Stalin insisted on taking reparations. And so he chose to take reparations from his part of Germany. Now, the United States emerged from this as a great economic power, as we talked about. Not only did the war bring us out of the Great Depression, but it also ushered in an era of unprecedented economic prosperity. And so we were the world's leading consumer of resources, and we were the world's leading wealthy country. And so there were a large amount of raw materials and a large amount of people in Eastern Europe that we could both buy raw materials from and sell finished products to. And so we hoped to gain access to those markets. Now, the Soviet Union also emerged from this war as a great economic and military and political power. But unlike the United States, much of the war had been fought on Soviet soil, and the Soviets had suffered heavy losses. Stalin hoped to emerge from this war as a leading military and economic power as well, but he hoped to install communism throughout Europe. Communism is based on the ideas of Karl Marx, and Karl Marx believed that this system would be a worldwide revolution. You know, he said, and I've said many times, the history hitherto of mankind has been that of class struggle. And then he concludes his manifesto by saying, workers of the world, unite. Again, communism hoped to be a worldwide revolution. And so in 1946, Stalin announced that war between communism and capitalism, these two opposing ideologies, would be inevitable. Meanwhile, we had spies in the we had spies in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets had spies in the United States, obviously. And our leading man in the Soviet Union was named Joseph Kennan. And in a report called The Long Telegram, you'll hear more about in the next clip, Kennan recommended a policy of containment. That we must contain the spread of the communist ideology, that we must stop its spread wherever around the globe. Churchill also made a speech, and I'll play it for you in a second, where he described this division as an iron curtain. He said, from Stettin to Trieste, an iron curtain has descended upon Europe, describing communism as a totalitarian ideology, pitting freedom versus communism. And at that point, Stalin announced that a war was inevitable. So, Kennan's policy of containment was readily adopted by the president, and it became known as the Truman Doctrine. And it was U.S. policy throughout the Cold War. And while this was a conflict between the U.S. and the USSR, thank God neither nation directly confronted the other on the battlefield. But the Truman Doctrine maintained that we would support any armed minorities or outsiders that were resisting communism within their own countries. And in following this policy, immediately after the Second World War, we began sending aid to Greece and Turkey because they were experiencing communist revolutions in their own states. Greece and Turkey's economies were on the verge of collapsing. and we sent them aid so that they may resist communism. In fact, in 1947, we sent aid to 16 different nations to help Western Europe rebuild after the Second World War. This was called the Marshall Plan. We spent as much money to rebuild these nations as we did to rebuild our own during the Great Depression. George Marshall, then Secretary of State, believed this to be a win because even though it was an extremely expensive prospect, he claimed it was cheaper than fighting a war. And so that to bolster these Western European nations, to prevent their turning towards communism, we would win diplomatically without having to fight on the battlefield. And so this first major confrontation of the Cold War was the Berlin Airlift. In 1948, Joseph Stalin realized that within his block of East Germany lied the city of Berlin. The city of Berlin was also divided into 4 parts, one of which was controlled by the Soviets, the rest controlled by the United States, Britain, and France. Stalin hoped to complete his conquest of the city of Berlin, which the Soviet army had taken by force at the cost of 250,000 lives, without having to confront the United States militarily. And so he closed off the roads, closed off all rail routes, all means that the West had of supplying their portions of the city. And so the Western powers instituted an airlift, meaning that for a period of time lasting nearly a year, we supplied a city of millions through parachute drops, all throughout the winter of 1948 and 49, until finally Stalin lifted the blockade. Because of our fear of the Soviets and our fear of the spread of communism, we joined the only peacetime military alliance that we've ever been a part of, called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. The United States and 16 nations agreed to collective security and mutual support in the event of hostility. And we are still a part of this alliance today. And so here's a photograph of the Berlin Airlift. You see these giant cargo planes which were dropping supplies to the Berliners. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 26, Section 2. And this is how the Cold War heats up. And what I mean is we're going to be talking about several different conflicts that the United States was involved in. Now, after World War II, the communist movement was growing. When China became a communist nation and Korea split along communism, meaning that North Korea became a communist state, South Korea became a democratic one. These are 2 very concerning events in U.S. foreign policy. We'll start with China. China was devastated by the Second World War. This story is not emphasized to the degree that it should be. 20 million Chinese people died at the hands of the Japanese. Untold devastation was wrought. Most Chinese people were desperately poor, and they increasingly felt that the government did not represent them. The Chinese nationalist government, the existing government which had the support of the United States, was led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek. He was extremely unpopular, seen as inefficient and corrupt by his own people, yet had the support of the United States because he was resisting communism in his country. However, the communist movement in China was growing, led by a man named Mao Zedong, had the support of the poor, which was most Chinese, the peasants, the working classes, the disenfranchised flocked to Mao Zedong's cause. And they were able to take control of northern China by the end of the Second World War. And this began a time of civil war. In fact, from 1944 to 1947, the nationalists continued to try to oppose the communist movement in China. The United States attempted to support the Chinese nationalists. However, by 1949, the war was over. The nationalist government fled to the island of Taiwan and set up an exile, and continue to be a government in exile today. The United States refused to recognize the People's Republic of China, the new communist government there, and continued to send support to the government in exile in Taiwan. This is a very concerning situation, because at this point we committed to defend, to provide aid and military support to Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. Meanwhile, the American people were stunned by this communist takeover. Because now at this point the world's largest country and the world's most populated country have become communist. So who do we blame when things don't go our way? We blame the president. Instead of thanks Obama, it was thanks Truman. You should have sent more aid. You should have done more. You should have gone to war with China. And McCarthy's even going to say you should have nuked China. But thankfully, Truman was not ready to start World War III over this matter. Now, the end of the Second World War left several countries divided. Korea was the first of these to erupt into a civil war. Korea had been conquered by the Japanese in the 1930s. And when Japan surrendered, they surrendered the north part of Korea to the Soviet Union and the southern part of Korea to the United States. In the South, a democracy emerged with the support of the United States and continues today. In the North, a communist state emerged with the support of the Soviet Union. In 1950, North Korea invaded the South, thus beginning the Korean War. South Korea appealed to the United Nations to stop the invasion. The Security Council approved a joint resolution to send a coalition representing many different nations under the command of General Douglas MacArthur to halt the North Korean invasion of South Korea. And this began the U.S. entry into its first Cold War conflict. And so you saw MacArthur's counterattack as the North Koreans drove south, capturing the South Korean capital at Seoul. The UN and South Korean troops were forced into a small sliver of South Korea. In this daring attack, the UN coalition drove north, while the U.S. Navy led an amphibious assault. And this two-pronged attack was largely successful until the Chinese sent 200,000 soldiers to help North Korea. They were able to drive back the UN offensive and once again force them into defensive fighting, which went on for 2 more years. And so when the Chinese army got involved, MacArthur requested a declaration of war against China itself. Truman rejected this request. The Soviet Union and China had a mutual assistance pact, meaning that if we go to war against China, we go to war against the Soviet Union. MacArthur was suggesting World War III, and the president rejected his request. Meanwhile, South Korea and the United Nations were able to retake the South Korean capital and able to advance north to the 38th parallel, which is the current DMZ, Demilitarized Zone, or dividing border between North and South Korea. MacArthur continued to insist that we needed to invade China, that this was our moment of opportunity. In fact, he appealed directly to the American people. He started an advertising campaign to unite the people against the president so that we would insist for an invasion of China. MacArthur had a great deal of public support. Americans were very concerned about the growing threat of communism, and people were willing to commit to World War III to stop the spread of communism. To stop MacArthur, who wanted to nuke China, the president fired our 5-star general. A congressional committee was held, investigating whether or not the president even had the authority to fire a 5-star general. And the congressional committee concluded that Truman was right. Now, in 1951, the Soviet Union finally suggested a ceasefire. Talks ensued, but the war went on for 2 more years until an armistice was declared in 1953. The terms of this ceasefire would be that Korea would remain divided. A demilitarized zone would be established between the 2 now separate states, and this war would be considered a draw. 40,000 Americans gave their lives in this conflict that was inconclusive. The high human and financial cost of the war spelled an end to President Truman's presidency, and Dwight D. Eisenhower would be elected president in the next election. And it was Dwight D. Eisenhower who at the end of his presidency warned of the growing influence of the military-industrial complex, saying that this prolonged conflict was only leading to the growing influence of the military in U.S. policy, and that concerning rise to power of the military could lead to future prolonged conflicts. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 26, Section 3, and that is the Cold War at Home. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, fear of communism led to reckless charges against innocent citizens.
Libria, I congratulate you. At last, peace reigns in the heart of man. At last, war is but a word whose meaning fades from our understanding. At last, we are whole. symptom is hate. Its symptom is anger. Its symptom is rage. Its symptom is war. The disease is human emotion. But Libria, I congratulate you. For there is a cure for this disease. At the cost of the dizzying highs of human emotion, we have suppressed its abysmal lows. And you, as a society, have embraced this cure. Prosium. Now we are at peace with ourselves, and humankind is one. War is gone. Hate, a memory. We are our own conscience now. And it is this conscience that guides us to rate EC10 for emotional content. All those things that might tempt us to feel again. And destroy them.
Librians, you have won. Against all odds and your own natures. You have survived.
Every time we come from the Nethers to the city, reminds me why we do what we do.
Does?
I beg your pardon?
It does.
The following items have been rated EC10 condemned. 7 works of two-dimensional illustrated material. 7 discs of musical content. 20 interactive strategy computer programs.
7 works of two-dimensional illustrated material. 7 discs.
Thank you for coming, cleric. I assume you know who I am.
Yes, sir, of course. You are Vice Consul DuPont of the Third Conciliary of the Tetragrammaton. Father's voice.
Quite frankly, cleric, I am told that you were very nearly a prodigal student, knowing almost instantly if someone is feeling...
I have a good record, sir.
Why do you imagine that is, cleric?
I'm not sure, Vice Consul. Somehow, I'm able, on some level, to sense how an offender thinks, to put myself in their position.
If you had ceased your interval, if you were a sense offender.
I suppose you could say that, sir.
You're a family man, cleric.
Yes, sir, a boy and a girl. The boy's in the monastery himself, on path to becoming a cleric.
Good. And the mother?
My spouse was arrested and incinerated for sense offense 4 years ago, sir.
By yourself?
No, sir, by another.
How did you feel about that?
I'm sorry, I don't fully understand, sir.
How did you feel?
I didn't feel anything.
Really? How is it that you came to miss it?
I've asked myself that same question, sir. I don't know.
A nearly unforgivable lapse, cleric. I trust you'll be more vigilant in the future.
Yes, sir. Every time we come from the Nethers to the city, reminds me why we do what we do.
It does.
Every time we come from the Nethers to the city, reminds me why we do what we do. Prosecutorial evidence for ANR 136890. I need it. It was late this afternoon. May not have showed up in the records yet.
Very sorry, Cleric. Nothing has been logged and nothing is pending under that entry.
It was an item of evidence brought in personally by Grammaton Errol Partridge. Check again.
Sir, Cleric Partridge has not entered anything in for weeks.
You're mistaken. It was a book of some kind.
Cleric. There's nothing.
Thank you.
He's been passing through the gate into the Nether every night for the last 2 weeks. We assumed it was enforcement related.
You always knew. But I, being poor, I've only my dreams. I've spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. I assume you dream, Preston.
I'll do what I can to see they go easy on you.
We both know they never go easy.
Then I'm sorry.
No, you're not. You don't even know the meaning. It's just a vestigial word for a feeling you've never felt. Don't you see, Preston? It's gone. Everything that makes us what we are, traded away.
There's no war. No murder.
What is it you think we do?
No. You've been with me. You've seen how it can be. The jealousy, the rage.
A heavy cost. I paid gladly.
So first we'll start by talking about the fear of communist influence. In the early years of the Cold War, many Americans believed that there was good reason to be concerned about the security of the United States. The Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the communist takeover of China shocked the American public, fueling a fear that communism would spread around the world. In addition, at the height of World War II, about 80,000 Americans claimed membership in the Communist Party. Some people feared that the first loyalty of these American communists was to the Soviet Union. Strongly anti-communist Republicans began to accuse Truman of being soft on communism. Consequently, in March of 1947, President Truman issued an executive order setting up the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, which included the Loyalty Review Board. Its purpose was to investigate government employees and to dismiss those who were found to be disloyal to the United States government. The U.S. Attorney General drew up a list of 91, quote, subversive organizations. and whose membership in any of these groups was grounds for suspicion. From 1947 to 1951, government loyalty boards investigated 3.2 million employees and dismissed 212 as security risks. Another 2,900 resigned because they did not want to be investigated or felt that the investigation violated their constitutional rights. Individuals under investigation were not allowed to see the evidence against them. The House Un-American Activities Committee. Other agencies investigated possible communist influence, both inside and outside the U.S. government. The most famous of these was the House Un-American Activities Committee, known as HUAC. HUAC first made headlines in 1947 when it began to investigate communist influence in the movie industry. The committee believed that communists were sneaking propaganda into these films. The committee pointed to the pro-Soviet films made during World War II when the Soviet Union had been a United States ally. HUAC subpoenaed 43 witnesses from the Hollywood film industry in September of 1947. Many of the witnesses were, quote, friendly, supporting the accusation that communists had infiltrated the film industry. For example, the movie star Gary Cooper said he had, quote, turned down quite a few scripts because I thought they were tinged with communist ideas. However, when asked which scripts he meant, Cooper couldn't remember their titles. 10 unfriendly witnesses were called to testify but refused. These men, known as the Hollywood 10, decided not to cooperate because they believed that the hearings were unconstitutional. Because the Hollywood 10 refused to answer questions, they were sent to prison. In response to the hearings, Hollywood executives instituted a blacklist, a list of people whom they condemned for having a communist background. People who were blacklisted, approximately 500 actors, writers, producers, and directors, had their careers ruined because they could no longer work. The McCarran Act. As Hollywood tried to rid itself of communists, Congress decided that Truman's Loyalty Review Board did not go far enough. In 1950, Congress passed the McCarran Internal Security Act. This made it unlawful to plan any action that might lead to the establishment of a totalitarian dictatorship in the United States. Truman vetoed the bill, saying, and I quote, "In a free country, we punish men for the crimes they commit, but never for the opinions they have." But Congress enacted the law over Truman's veto. Spy cases stunned the nation. 2 spy cases added to the fear that was spreading like an epidemic across the country. One case involved a former State Department official named Algier Hiss. In 1948, a former communist spy named Whittaker Chambers accused Algier Hiss of spying for the Soviet Union. To support his charges, Chambers produced microfilm of government documents that he claimed had been typed on Hiss's typewriter. Too many years had passed for government prosecutors to charge Hiss with espionage, but a jury convicted him of perjury for lying about passing the documents and sent him to jail. A young conservative Republican congressman named Richard Nixon gained fame for pursuing the charges against Hiss. Within 4 years of the highly publicized case, Nixon was elected Vice President of the United States. Hiss claimed that he was innocent and that Chambers had forged the documents used against him. However, in the 1990s, Soviet cables released by the National Security Agency seemed to prove Hiss's guilt. The Rosenbergs. Another spy case rocked the nation even more than the Hiss case, particularly because of international events occurring around the same time. On September 3rd of 1949, Americans learned that the Soviet Union had exploded an atomic bomb. Most American experts had predicted that it would take the Soviets 3 to 5 more years to make the bomb. People began to wonder if communist supporters in the United States had leaked the secret of the bomb. This second spy case seemed to confirm the suspicion. In 1950, the German-born physicist Klaus Fuchs admitted giving the Soviet Union information about America's atomic bomb. The information probably enabled Soviet scientists to develop their own atomic bomb years earlier than they would have otherwise. Implicated in the Fuchs case were Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, minor activists in the American Communist Party. When asked if they were communist, the Rosenbergs denied the charges against them and pled the Fifth Amendment, choosing not to incriminate themselves. They claimed they were being persecuted both for being Jewish and for holding radical beliefs. The Rosenbergs were found guilty of espionage and sentenced to death. In pronouncing their sentence, Judge Irving Kaufman declared their crime, quote, worse than murder. To him, they were directly responsible for one of the deadliest clashes of the Cold War. People from all over the world appealed for clemency for the Rosenbergs. Many considered the evidence and testimony too weak to warrant the death sentence. The case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but the court refused to overturn the conviction. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg died in the electric chair in June of 1953, leaving behind 2 sons. They became the first U.S. civilians executed for espionage. McCarthy launches his witch hunt. The most famous anti-communist activist was Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin. During his first 3 years in the Senate, he had acquired a reputation for being an ineffective legislator. By January of 1950, he realized that he was going to need a winning issue in order to be reelected in 1952. Looking for such an issue, McCarthy charged that communists were taking over the government. McCarthy's tactics. Taking advantage of people's concerns about communism, McCarthy made one unsupported accusation after another. These attacks on suspected communists in the early 1950s became known as McCarthyism. Since that time, McCarthyism has referred to the unfair tactic of accusing people of disloyalty without providing evidence. At various times, McCarthy claimed to have in his hands the names of 57, 81, and even 205 communists in the State Department. He never actually produced a single name, however. He also charged that the Democratic Party was guilty of, quote, 20 years of treason for allowing communist infiltration into the government. He was always careful to do his name calling only in the Senate, where he had legal immunity that protected him from being sued for slander. The Republicans did little to stop McCarthy's tactics because they believed they would win the 1952 presidential election if the public saw them purging the nation of communists. But one small group of 6 senators, led by Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, did speak out. And here's a quote from Margaret Smith. And I quote, "I speak as a Republican. I speak as a woman. I speak as a United States Senator. I speak as an American. I'm not proud of the way in which the Senate has made a publicity platform for irresponsible sensationalism. I am not proud of the reckless abandon in which unproved charges have been hurled from this side of the aisle." Finally, in 1954, McCarthy made accusations against the U.S. Army, which resulted in a nationally televised Senate investigation. McCarthy's bullying of witnesses alienated the audience and cost him public support. The Senate condemned him for improper conduct that, quote, tended to bring the Senate into dishonor and disrepute. 3 years later, Joseph McCarthy, suffering from alcoholism, died a broken man. Others besides Joseph McCarthy made it their mission to root communism out of American society. By 1953, 39 states passed laws making it illegal to advocate the violent overthrow of the government, even though such laws clearly violated the constitutional right of free speech. Across the nation, cities and towns passed similar laws. At times, the fear of communism seemed to have no limits. In Indiana, professional wrestlers had to take a loyalty oath. In experiments run by newspapers, pedestrians on the street refused to sign petitions that quoted the Declaration of Independence because they were afraid the ideas were communist. The government investigated union leaders, librarians, newspaper reporters, even scientists. It seemed that no profession was safe from the hunt for communists.
But it occurs to me that there's a bigger issue here today than whether or not I'm a communist.
Bigger issue? Mr. Appleton, there is no bigger issue.
Actually, not to be contrary, I think there is. Gosh, I don't quite know what to say here. The fact is, I've never been a man of great conviction. I never saw the percentage in it. And quite frankly, I suppose I lack the courage. See, I'm not like Luke Trimble. He had the market cornered on those things. I never met the guy, but I feel like I've gotten to know him. And the thing is, I can't help wondering what he'd say if he were standing here right now. You know, I think he'd probably tell you the America represented in this room is not the America he died defending. I think he'd tell you your America is bitter and cruel and small.
The chamber will come to order.
I know for a fact his America was big. Bigger than you can imagine. With a wide open heart. Where every person has a voice.
You are out of order,
even
sir.
if you don't like what they have to say.
Enough, sir. You are out of order.
If he were here, I wonder how you'd respond. If you could explain to him what happened to his America.
Mr. Appleton, you are skating on the very thin edge of contempt.
Well, that's the first thing I've heard today that I completely agree with.
Mr. Chairman! Chairman! Mr. Chairman! Mr. Chairman, my client is clearly under an enormous strain as a direct result of the belligerent questioning of Mr. Clyde, and he is therefore not responsible for his comments. At this time, we wish to invoke the Fifth Amendment.
No, we don't.
Yes, Pete, we do.
No, Kevin, we don't. So knock it off! Shut the hell up and let me get through this. The Fifth Amendment is out of the question. But there is another amendment that I'd like to invoke. I wonder if anyone here is familiar with it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Mr. Appleton, you're out of order,
Congress shall make no law respecting...
The chamber will come to order, Mr. Appleton.
An establishment of religion.
You're out of
Or
order.
prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Or abridging the freedom of speech. Or of the press. Or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances.
You will not presume to lecture this committee,
That's the
sir.
First Amendment, Mr. Chairman. It's everything we're about, if only we'd live up to it.
Let him talk. He's just hanging himself.
It's the most important part of the contract every citizen has with this country. And even though these contracts, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, even though they're just pieces of paper with signatures on them, they're the only contracts we have that are most definitely not subject to renegotiation. Not by you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Appleton!
Not by you, Mr. Clyde.
You will stand down, sir.
Not by anyone. Ever. Too many people have paid for this contract in blood.
Enough, sir. You are out of order.
People like Luke Trimble. And all the sons of Lawson, California.
Damn right. And they deserve better than this. All you boys do.
I will have order, or I will clear this chamber.
Today we'll be talking about Chapter 26, Section 4, and it's titled Two Nations Live on the Edge. And we'll be talking about how during the 1950s the United States and the Soviet Union came to the brink of nuclear war.
Diddle-dum-dum, diddle-dum-dum, diddle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. when danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
and you
and you
and you, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association.
Produced by Archer Productions, Incorporated. Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time. Fire is a danger. It can burn whole buildings if someone is careless. But we are ready for fire. We have a fine fire department to put out the fire, and you have fire drills in your school so you know what to do. Automobiles can be dangerous, too. They sometimes cause bad accidents, but we are ready. We have safety rules that car drivers and
Now, first we'll be talking about Brinkmanship and how it ruled U.S. policy. Although air raid drills were not common until the Eisenhower years, and that is the years between 1953 and 1961, the nuclear arms race began during Truman's presidency. When the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb in 1949, President Truman had to make a terrible decision: whether to develop an even more horrifying weapon. And this leads us to the race for the H-bomb. The scientists who developed the atomic bomb had suspected since 1942 that it was possible to create an even more destructive thermonuclear weapon, the hydrogen bomb or the H-bomb. They estimated that such a bomb would have the force of 1 million tons of TNT, 65 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But they argued vehemently about the morality of creating such a destructive weapon. Despite such concerns, the United States entered into a deadly race with the Soviet Union to see which country would be the first to produce an H-bomb. On November 1st of 1952, the United States won the race when it exploded the first H-bomb. However, the American advantage lasted less than a year. In August of 1953, the Soviets exploded their own thermonuclear weapon. The policy of Brinkmanship. By the time both countries had the H-bomb, Dwight D. Eisenhower was president. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was staunchly anti-communist. For Dulles, the Cold War was a moral crusade against communism. Dulles proposed that the United States could prevent the spread of communism by promising to use all of its force, including nuclear weapons, against any aggressor nation. The willingness of the United States under President Eisenhower to go to the edge of an all-out war became known as Brinkmanship. Under this policy, the United States trimmed its Army and Navy and expanded its Air Force, which would deliver the bombs, and its buildup of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union followed suit. The threat of nuclear attack was unlike any the American people had ever faced. Even if only a few bombs reached their targets, millions of civilians would die. School children practiced air raid procedures, and some families built underground fallout shelters in their backyards. Fear of nuclear war became a constant in American life for the next 30 years. The Cold War spreads around the world. As the nation shifted to a dependence on nuclear arms, the Eisenhower administration began to rely heavily on the recently formed Central Intelligence Agency known as the CIA for information. The CIA used spies to gather information abroad. The CIA also began to carry out covert or secret operations to weaken or overthrow governments unfriendly to the United States. Covert actions in the Middle East and Latin America. One of the CIA's first covert actions took place in the Middle East. In 1951, Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized Iran's oil fields. That is, he placed the formerly private industries, owned mostly by Great Britain, under Iranian control. To protest, the British stopped buying Iranian oil. As the Iranian economy faltered, the United States feared that Mossadegh might turn to the Soviets for help. In 1953, the CIA gave several $million to anti-Mossadegh supporters. The CIA wanted the pro-American Shah of Iran, who had recently been forced to flee, to return to power. The plan worked. The Shah returned to power and turned over control of the Iranian oil fields to Western companies. In 1954, the CIA also took covert actions in Guatemala, a Central American country just south of Mexico. Eisenhower believed that Guatemala's government had communist sympathies because it had given more than 200,000 acres of American-owned land to peasants. In response, the CIA trained an army which invaded Guatemala. The Guatemalan army refused to defend the president and he resigned. The army's leader then became dictator of the country. The Warsaw Pact. In spite of the growing tension between the superpowers, U.S.-Soviet relations seemed to thaw following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. The Soviets recognized West Germany and concluded peace treaties with Austria and Japan. However, in 1955, when West Germany was allowed to rearm and join NATO, the Soviet Union grew fearful. It formed its own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact linked the Soviet Union with 7 Eastern European countries. A summit in Geneva. In July of 1955, Eisenhower traveled to Geneva, Switzerland to meet with Soviet leaders. There, Eisenhower put forth an open skies proposal. The United States and Soviet Union would allow flights over each other's territory to guard against surprise nuclear attacks. Although the Soviet Union rejected this proposal, the world hailed the spirit of Geneva as a step toward peace. The Suez War. In 1955, the same year in which the Geneva Summit took place, Great Britain and the United States agreed to help Egypt finance construction of a dam at Aswan on the Nile River. However, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's head of government, tried to play the Soviets and the Americans against each other by improving relations with each one in order to get more aid. In 1956, after learning that Nasser was making deals with the Soviets, Dulles withdrew his offer of a loan. Angered, Nasser responded by nationalizing the Suez Canal, the Egyptian waterway that was owned by France and Great Britain. The French and the British were outraged. Egyptian control of the canal also affected Israel. Nasser refused to let ships bound for Israel pass through the canal, even though the canal was supposed to be open to all nations. Israel responded by sending troops. So did Great Britain and France. The 3 countries seized the Mediterranean end of the canal. The UN quickly stepped in to stop the fighting. It persuaded Great Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw. However, it allowed Egypt to keep control of the canal. The Eisenhower Doctrine. The Soviet Union's prestige in the Middle East rose because of its support for Egypt. To counterbalance this development, President Eisenhower issued a warning in January of 1957. This warning, known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, said that the United States would defend the Middle East against an attack by any communist country. In March, Congress officially approved the doctrine. The Hungarian Uprising. Even as fighting was raging in the Middle East, a revolt began in Hungary. Dominated by the Soviet Union since the end of World War II, the Hungarian people rose in revolt in 1956. They called for a democratic government. Imre Nagy, the most popular and liberal Hungarian communist leader, formed a new government. He promised free elections, denounced the Warsaw Pact, and demanded that all Soviet troops leave Hungary. The Soviet response was swift and brutal. In November of 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary and killed approximately 30,000 Hungarians. Armed with only pistols and bottles, thousands of Hungarian freedom fighters threw up barricades in the streets and fought the invaders to no avail. The Soviets overthrew the Nagy government and replaced it with pro-Soviet leaders. Nagy himself was executed. Some 200,000 Hungarians fled to the west. Although the Truman Doctrine had promised to support free peoples who resisted communism, the United States did nothing to help Hungary break free of Soviet control. Many Hungarians were bitterly disappointed. The American policy of containment did not extend to driving the Soviet Union out of its satellites. No help came to Hungary from the United Nations either. Although the UN passed one resolution after another condemning the Soviet Union, the Soviet veto in the Security Council stopped the UN from taking any action.